The chair had been empty for 347 nights. Front row, center section, seat 12. Every night before Frank Sinatra's show at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, his stage manager would rope it off. No explanation, no exceptions. Even when the casino owner complained about losing money on a prime seat, Frank's only response was, "Leave it empty." The crew whispered about it backstage. Some said it was for a lost love. Others claimed it was superstition, something Frank did for good luck. A few thought he was just being eccentric, the way famous people sometimes are when they've run out of normal ways to be interesting. But nobody knew the truth. It was April 1958, a Saturday night, and the Sands was packed with the usual crowd. High rollers in tuxedos, movie stars hiding behind cigarette smoke, tourists who'd saved for months just to see Frank Sinatra live. The orchestra was warming up, and the energy in the room was electric. Frank stood backstage in his dressing room, adjusting his tie in the mirror. He looked good, sharp black suit, crisp white shirt, the kind of polish that made people forget he'd grown up poor in Hoboken. But when he looked at his own reflection, all he saw was someone pretending. "5 minutes, Mr. Sinatra," came the call from the hallway. Frank nodded, took a breath, and walked toward the stage. As he passed through the curtain and the spotlight hit him, the audience erupted. Applause crashed over him like a wave, and for a moment, everything felt right. This was what he did. This was who he was. He grabbed the microphone with practiced ease and smiled that famous Sinatra smile. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How you doing tonight?" More applause, more screaming, more love from strangers. Frank launched into "Come Fly With Me," and the room belonged to him. His voice filled every corner, smooth and confident, wrapping around the melody like it had been born there. The band was tight. The audience was with him. Everything was perfect, except for seat 12. Frank tried not to look at it, the way he always did. The empty chair was a private ritual, something he'd promised himself he'd keep doing until he stopped mid-phrase. Someone was sitting there, a man, middle-aged, dark hair, wearing a simple gray suit that didn't quite fit. His face was weathered, tired, and painfully familiar. The band kept playing for a few more bars before they noticed Frank had stopped singing. The conductor turned, confused, and gestured for them to keep going. But Frank wasn't moving. He was staring at the man in seat 12. The audience began to murmur, uncertain what was happening. Frank's hand tightened around the microphone. His throat felt like someone had wrapped wire around it. The man in the chair looked back at him with eyes that held 15 years of silence. Joseph, Frank's younger brother, the brother he hadn't spoken to since 1943, the brother he'd betrayed. The band finally stopped playing. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the clink of glasses and confused whispers rippling through the crowd. Frank stood frozen under the spotlight, his heart hammering in his chest. He opened his mouth to continue the song, but nothing came out. The professional performer, the man who'd sung through illness and exhaustion and heartbreak, couldn't produce a single note. Someone in the audience coughed. Another person laughed nervously, thinking this was part of the act. But Frank's face told a different story. His stage manager stepped into the wings, ready to handle whatever crisis was unfolding, but Frank held up one hand without looking away from Joseph. A silent message: "Don't interfere." The two brothers stared at each other across 30 feet of space that felt like 30 miles. Frank's mind was racing backward, to a cramped apartment in New Jersey, to a moment 15 years ago that had split their family in half. It had been about money. Or maybe it had been about pride, or jealousy, or all three twisted together into something ugly and permanent. Frank was just starting to break through as a singer, getting regular radio spots and attention from record labels. Joseph was struggling, working double shifts at the docks, trying to support their mother after their father died. He'd asked Frank for help, not a handout, a loan, just enough to keep them afloat. And Frank had said no. Not because he didn't have the money, but because Joseph had said something about Frank's music, something dismissive, something that hit Frank's pride in exactly the wrong way. So Frank had turned cold, had told Joseph that if he couldn't make it on his own, that wasn't Frank's problem. Joseph had left that apartment, and they hadn't spoken since. Their mother had died 2 years later, begging Frank on her deathbed to make peace with his brother. Frank had promised, but he'd never followed through. Because pride is a comfortable prison. And it's easier to stay locked inside than to admit you were wrong. And now, after 347 nights of keeping that seat empty, hoping without quite admitting he was hoping, Joseph had finally come. Frank slowly set the microphone down on its stand. The metallic clunk echoed through the silent room. He stepped off the stage. The audience watched in stunned confusion as Frank Sinatra walked down the steps and into the crowd. Women reached out to touch him as he passed, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on Joseph. When Frank reached the front row, he stopped in front of seat 12. Joseph looked up at him, his expression unreadable, hurt, guarded, waiting. Frank had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In some versions, he was angry, in others, defensive. In a few, he convinced himself that Joseph owed him the apology, that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. But standing there, looking at his brother's face, seeing the years carved into it like scars, Frank realized something. None of his imagined versions had ever included the truth. He'd been wrong, completely, irreversibly. Wrong. Frank's legs felt weak. The pride that had held him upright for 15 years suddenly buckled. He dropped to his knees in front of his brother. The audience gasped. Somewhere in the back, a woman started crying. Even the band members were leaning forward, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Frank looked up at Joseph, his voice barely a whisper. I was wrong. 3 words, simple, devastating, true. Joseph's eyes filled with tears. Frank, I was wrong, Frank repeated louder now. About everything, about the money, about pride, about thinking my career mattered more than you. Frank, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Frank's voice cracked. I let you struggle. I let Mama die without fixing this. I kept this seat empty because I was too much of a coward to come find you. Joseph reached down and grabbed Frank's shoulders. Stand up. Not until you... Stand up, Frank. Frank stood slowly. The 2 brothers faced each other, tears streaming down both their faces. Joseph pulled Frank into a hug that felt like coming home after 15 years of being lost. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. The kind of sound people make when they've witnessed something sacred, something that reminds them they're human. Frank held his brother and sobbed into his shoulder, not caring that 2,000 people were watching, not caring that he'd stopped the show, not caring about anything except the fact that Joseph's arms were around him, and the weight he'd been carrying for 15 years was finally lifting. When they finally pulled apart, Joseph smiled through his tears. Yeah, you always were dramatic. Frank laughed, a sound that was half sob, half relief. Had to learn it somewhere. You were always the one making scenes. Me? You're the one who just stopped a sold-out Vegas show to apologize. It's called showmanship. They both laughed then, the kind of laughter that only comes after years of pain have finally cracked open. Frank turned to face the audience, his arms still around Joseph's shoulders. He picked up the microphone from the stand, his hand shaking slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'd like you to meet my brother, Joseph. We haven't spoken in 15 years because I was stubborn and stupid and too proud to admit when I was wrong. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I kept that seat empty every night, Frank continued, hoping he'd walk in, hoping I'd get the chance to say what I should have said a long time ago. He paused, looking down at Joseph. I'm sorry for everything. Joseph squeezed his brother's shoulder. I'm sorry, too. Frank shook his head. You don't have anything to be sorry for. I said your music didn't matter. That was wrong. Your music matters, Frank. It matters to all these people. It always mattered to me, even when I was too hurt to admit it. Frank's throat tightened again, but this time he managed to speak through it. You know what matters more than the music? What? You, family, the people who knew me before I was Frank Sinatra. He gestured to the crowd. These folks, they love the voice. But you knew Francis Albert, the kid who couldn't carry a tune until he was 12, the one who cried when Mama made him sing in church. Joseph laughed. You were terrible. I was awful. But you kept trying because you told me I could do it. The 2 brothers looked at each other, and 15 years of silence dissolved into forgiveness. Frank turned back to the microphone. So here's what we're going to do. Joseph, you're going to sit in that chair, your chair, and I'm going to finish this show. And tomorrow night, you're going to sit there again, and every night after that for as long as you'll come. Joseph nodded, wiping his eyes. I'll be here. Promise? Promise. Frank helped his brother sit down, then walked back to the stage. When he climbed the steps and faced the audience again, something was different. The weight in his chest was gone. The smile on his face was real. He picked up the microphone and nodded to the conductor. Now, where were we? The band started playing again, and Frank sang "Come Fly With Me" from the beginning. But this time, every word landed differently. There was a lightness in his voice, a freedom that hadn't been there before. He sang for the next 2 hours, and it was one of the best performances of his career. Not because the notes were perfect or the technique flawless, but because for the first time in 15 years, Frank Sinatra wasn't singing to fill a void. He was singing because he was whole again. When the show ended and the final applause faded, Frank stood on stage and looked down at seat 12. Joseph was still there, and he always would be. The next morning, the Las Vegas papers ran the story. Sinatra stops show for family reunion. Some critics called it unprofessional. Others called it the most honest moment they'd ever witnessed in entertainment. Frank didn't care what they called it. He'd spent 15 years singing for thousands of strangers, trying to fill the hole left by one person. And he'd learned something that night that no amount of applause could teach him. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It's about 3 small words, spoken from your knees, to the one person who needs to hear them. I was wrong. From that night forward, seat 12 was never empty again. Joseph came to every show, and when people asked Frank about it, he'd smile and say, "That's my brother's seat. That's where he belongs." Years later, when journalists would ask Frank about the defining moment of his career, he never mentioned the hit records or the sold-out tours or the movie roles. He talked about the night he stopped the show, the night he dropped to his knees, the night he learned that the most important song he'd ever sing wasn't a song at all. It was 3 words of truth, delivered to the one person who'd been waiting 15 years to hear them. Because sometimes the biggest stages in our lives aren't the ones with spotlights and microphones. They're the moments when we kneel before the people we've hurt and admit the truth we've been running from. That's when the real performance begins.